It's all
Okay.
yours.
Hi, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Dan Brady from Arlington's Cultural Affairs Division. Thank you for having us today. I'm excited to be here with Courtney. I just want to tell you briefly what the literary programs of Cultural Affairs are. Hopefully, you've seen them out in the community. Um, we run a moving words poetry competition, which puts poems on the Arlington art buses, the green buses you see all around town. So we do that for both adults and for students, grades kindergarten through 12. Um, we have a program called The Poet Is In, which you may have seen at the public libraries around town, where we'll have poems sit and you can give them a theme or a topic and they'll write a poem on demand for you. Within about 5 minutes, you'll come away with a personalized poem. That program takes place in April in the libraries every year. We also run a program in the schools to bring poets into the schools, teach workshops for students, get them acquainted with poetry. And then the last big piece of what I do for cultural affairs is work on the Poet Laureate program. So I'm honored to have Courtney here. Courtney is our third Poet Laureate. She was just selected and announced earlier this summer. This is actually her first official event as Poet Laureate. So you got in early and got the scoop, which is great. But she was very accomplished long before we gave her this honor. She just published her third book of poetry, which is an award-winning collection, and she's been touring all around the country lately, which has been really fun to see. She also edits her own press called Riot in Your Throat, which publishes books of poetry based here in Arlington. So she's very busy, and she's an awesome poet and community member. So I'm excited to have this conversation with her. I have a few questions to kind of open things up, and then I think Courtney is going to read some poems for us, and then we'll move to sort of a general Q&A, and we'll get all your questions from the group. So Courtney, great to see you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So since this is your first official Poet Laureate event, I thought I'd ask you, what does the role of Poet Laureate mean to you? When you say Poet Laureate, what is that job description? And are there anything you want to accomplish in your time in Poet Laureate for Arlington?
I have a lot of things I want to accomplish. How many I'll actually get to, we'll see. For me, what it boils down to, though, is being Poet Laureate means I have the opportunity to bring something I love, which is poetry, to the community I love, which is Arlington. I've lived here for about a decade. I've been on the East Coast for 24 years now. Before that, I lived in the Midwest. That's where I grew up. But it wasn't until I moved to Arlington that I really felt like I was where I was supposed to be. So being Poet Laureate is really special to me right now. I feel that poetry is especially important. It allows us to find connections with people. And I think that right now that's, something we really need as a county, as a community, as a nation. And so hopefully I'll be able to share poetry with all sorts of people that live here, and we can find the things that bring us together rather than the things that push us apart.
Why do you think people come to poetry? What's the appeal?
I think it's probably different for everyone. For me, it's a way to see myself. If someone writes a poem that I really identify with, I feel like I'm not alone in whatever I'm dealing with or feeling or struggling with, or the situation I'm going through. So I think people find solace and connection in poetry. I also think you can be entertained. There are a lot of really entertaining, weirdly funny poets out there that can just make you feel good. And it's also nice because I think poetry can be really hard to write. So if you come across a good poet, I'm always in awe a little bit, and I really love feeling that. I think it's kind of special.
So I know you're a voracious reader. You're always, if anyone's on Instagram, follow Courtney's Instagram, because she's always posting what she's reading. And she goes through so many books. It's awesome to see, and most of them are from the Arlington County Public Library, I believe, which is nice. But are there other poets that you would recommend that people check out or get into?
Oh my gosh, yeah. I could just talk for 2 hours about this. So I'll just list a few. Ada Limon, she is our current U.S. Poet Laureate. She is amazing. I highly recommend her books. Melissa Fight Johnson is a really lovely poet out of the Midwest. Kelly Grace Thomas is amazing. Amorak Huey, he's delightful. Megan Falley, Laura Passon, Jean Ann Verlee. I can put these names in the chat so you all don't have to try to remember them.
That's a good place to start. Lots of options there. So, having read your books, you write a lot about the body, and there's this kind of physicality to your poems, both the body's limitations and wonders, and I think in particular, aging and dealing with how we think about the body. Can you tell us a bit about your interest in this topic and why you think that's such a well that you can draw from?
Yeah, I think for me, as a woman growing up in most of my childhood and adult life with 80s, 90s, and I think that really shaped me in terms of how I viewed my own body, my expectations of it, and so I've dealt with a lot of disordered eating, which affects the body and the mind. And then I'm a runner. I'm a former competitive ultramarathoner, so I've run my whole life. And seeing your body grow strong and be able to push through boundaries is really amazing and sort of in awe of what the body can do. And then now I'm in my mid-40s, so obviously my body is changing, I'm aging, and I'm finding sort of a new acceptance, and then also some new strangeness with that we all sort of go through as your body ages and changes. And for me, writing about it is just one way to sort of noodle my way through it, come to terms with it, and hopefully love and accept my body a little bit more as I get older. It's not always easy, but I think I'm getting there, and I write a lot about that because I think a lot of other people feel that way and can identify with it.
Yeah. So I'm going to assume everyone's going to love this event and want to know all about poetry. So how do you think people can encounter poetry more often in their life? Where should people get started if they're thinking about learning more about poetry?
My number one recommendation, go to the public library. We are so blessed in Arlington. Our library is amazing, and their poetry collection is really extensive and really, really fantastic. And they carry a lot of living modern writers, which I'm really big on people reading. The old dead guys are great, but if you want someone who's writing about the topics that are relevant today, you can find all those writers in the Arlington Library. And what I often do, even as someone who knows a lot about poetry and reads it constantly, I will just go to the library, go to the poetry section, and literally just start pulling down books, and I pick them by their covers sometimes. It's true, we all do it, but it's a great way to find new poems and new poets that you might not otherwise be familiar with. And if you don't like it, you just turn it back in at the end of the 3 weeks or whatever. But the Arlington Public Library is absolutely the best place to go to get exposure to new poets and find new ones to love.
Yeah, great. All right, I would love to hear some of your poems now. So let's shift into that, and I will mute myself and come back for questions later.
Awesome. I have a bit of a set here. It's about 15 to 20 minutes long. And I'm going to give a couple of warnings in advance. I talk a lot about disordered eating. I talk a lot about my father's death. I have one in here about suicidal ideation. So these are some heavy poems, but I have hopefully some lighter ones mixed in there. But if you need to step away from the camera or turn your camera off, I'm not at all offended or upset. Just take care of yourself. So this first poem is titled, I Don't Eat After 8 p.m. I once read, you shouldn't eat after 8 p.m. if you want to lose weight, and I, a woman who hated her body for a decade, always wanted less to hate. The week my dad died, I ate my mother's pretzel dessert with a spoon, pan held beneath my chin like a trough, the salty-sweet combination filling my belly with calories I couldn't begin to count. I ran 7 miles each morning, the flat stretching before me unbroken. My father lay quiet, first in the hospital, then in the living room, no longer consuming anything, his small frame dark against the pale sheet. When I came inside, sweat slick and panting, I kissed his face, told him about my run, the flowers blooming in the ditch, the blue sheet of sky. That night, after my mother had finally gone to bed, I sat in the chair and pulled to my father's bedside and ate a cloud of carbs, the homemade bread my mother baked and I grew up on. I slathered on a layer of butter, licked the melted gold from my fingertips, told him in between bites that I loved him. When my therapist asks how I'm doing, I talk about the election, my father's death, my friend's brain tumor. I don't tell her about my 2.5-hour workout that morning, how I wouldn't stop until I burned 1,000 calories. I don't tell her of my daily ritual of stripping down, exhaling every ounce of breath before stepping onto the scale. How if there's a hair tie around my wrist, it must be removed and the ritual repeated. I don't tell her I know the calories in my morning coffee, 102, or my yogurt and granola, 170, or that I fear growing into my mother's body. I spent a decade eating nothing more than an apple and 2 rice cakes between the hours of 8 and 4. When I gave up that slow march toward a hungry death, I thought I'd be normal. But what is normal if not tracking every bite of broccoli? If not knowing the calories in a single baby carrot? I don't tell her because I like when my clavicles arch out from my chest, when my hip bones jut forward like handlebars. I don't tell her because I don't want to talk about what ended 15 years ago, even if its fingerprints remain permanently etched on me. Instead, I talk about the daily hikes with my dogs, my friend's chemo routine, the new meditation app I downloaded. The session ends and I scoop up the rumpled Kleenex and drop them in the garbage. There's a bowl of leftover Halloween candy near the exit. I dig for a Snickers, pop the bite-sized chocolate into my mouth, and make it last until I reach my car. This time, I don't record it. This time, I regret not taking 2. There came a point in the pandemic where I was doing a lot of Zoom workshops, but I kind of felt like I was running out of things to write about. And so in a workshop, I wrote this poem, and it's titled, "While trying to write a poem, I realized I have nothing to write about, so I contemplate having an affair." Because that would at least give me something to write about. But I think of all the reasons I shouldn't. I'd have to wear something other than yoga pants, have to go somewhere other than the grocery store or the park, because despite romantic comedies, I'm not meeting anyone there. I'd probably need to not wear a mask. And with this realization, the plan goes right out the window because no way in hell am I going maskless around someone I don't know. And no, I didn't include because I'm married to the list because that is a requirement for an affair. But this idea fails just as this poem is failing. So I saddle up this sad pony and ride it right off the page to the poem graveyard, which is littered with the bones of cliches and repeated words, mouth, hands, touch, taste, the discarded bodies of the lovers I've written about endlessly, the images I can't stop repeating, the ocean in my throat that keeps drowning the words, the death that haunts every line. When I get there, I settle onto the soft earth, dig my fingers into the freshly turned soil, and think of my father, how he once saddled a cow and donned a wig and rode it in a parade. How this remains one of my favorite stories about him, how it made the front page of the local paper, how my mother still has a copy. And I think of how, under that hot July sun, I held him in my hand, opened my palm, and the wind tornadoed him back to the land he loved, to the land that grazed cattle and grew crops. And I decide maybe I do have something to write about. I'm going to read a newer poem. I don't have it memorized. This one is titled Ode to My Gray Hair. And you can't really see on Zoom, but I'm growing my grays out. You can see it a little bit. Ode to My Gray Hair. First found along my part at 27, I laughed when I fingered that silver shaft of hair. Waited another decade to start covering it, $200 every 10 weeks to cover the gray growing out. I'm sorry I started. Sorry I wasted almost 6 years and thousands of dollars covering up what I so desperately want now. Silver fox, sexy fox, tattooed witch with burgundy lips and pewter streaks throughout my head. Less than an inch showing. It'll take me more than 2 years to grow you out, but baby, I'm committed to these sleek silvers coming in. Egyptians used henna to cover gray. Did Cleopatra do this, or did she flaunt her natural color, knowing with age comes wisdom, and she was more brilliant than both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony? Greeks and Romans, kings and queens, everyone sought color, not naturally theirs. I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you when my stylist said all her clients cover their grades so they can look professional. Because we both know I walk into the room, stilettos thumping, suit sharp, they call me Ms. LeBlanc. I fired that stylist for you. That's how dedicated I am. Now only a cluster at my temples, a bit along my part, the silvery white strands are starting to peek through, pushing further out. I talk sweet to them, this bright light against the rest of my dark brown hair, this silver crown I'll wear like a queen. I'm very excited to grow my gray out. I really wish I had like the solid streak that some people are gifted with, but
it won't take 2 years. It won't take 2 years.
I keep cutting it shorter so that it keeps coming out. This next poem is titled Naming the Moon, and it does have mention of or allusion to suicidal ideation. When she tells me she doesn't want to live anymore, I write a poem which feels like a cop-out. How can a poem help? But she's a poet too, so I think she might understand, might like this messed up tribute. I know it's not my responsibility to save her, but I remind her the same moon looks down on us. We only have one floating in our sky, and we're boring humans because it's just named Moon. Clearly the poets were not consulted. So I ask her, what would you name the moon? Death, darkness, the end of everything. I want to die, she says. Tears crowd my eyes, but I say, I'd name it hope. I'd name it wonder. I'd name it stay. One more night. Angel food cake. My father couldn't swallow at the end, the morphine absorbed through the soft in his cheek. I looked up recipes, learned the intricacies of making his favorite cake from scratch. The gossamer batter rising above the pan like an angel, the sugar haloing the air as they maneuvered the hospital bed past the dining room table and into the living room where the sunlight softened through the window. I sat beside him, held the pillow of sugar to his nose, hoped the cake would carry him to an afterlife I didn't believe in. I have kind of a weird obsession with opossums. They're a creepy little creature. They look very nightmarish, I think. And then they often, stand still when they get scared. That's their reaction. But they also are the largest eater of ticks. So they're very good for us, and they are the only animal immune to ticks. So like they're helping fight Lyme disease, I guess. So this is my ode to the opossum. You black-eyed creature, struck silent and motionless, you freeze at danger, hold still as if we can't see you. Wrongly called rodent, you marsupial, caring and carrying your young until you deem safe. You eater of insects and birds and fruit, you aren't picky, you pick at what others leave behind. Roadkill, rodents, the trash we wasteful humans discard. You weren't blessed with beauty or strength, but you do have courage, because what else but courage could hold you so still a potential predator's eyes slide from your gray body? You red light, green light champion. You freeze tag queen. You raise babies and teach them to neither fight or flight, but freeze, to hold so still you statue. And after your predator leaves, can't find you without the blush of movement, you slink slowly away, alive another midnight, ready to feast on today's leftovers, ready to own the night. I have just a couple more poems for you, and they are all about my father. Yesterday was actually the 3-year anniversary of my father's death, so I've written a lot about him. I was thankfully able to travel to where he lived and care for him in the last week of his life. So it was really meaningful to me to be able to do that for him. And this poem is titled, "We're All Made of Stars," for my father on his birthday. Growing up on a farm in the middle of America, nearly treeless and flat as the pancakes my mother made some Sundays after church, the stars were as plentiful as the snow that fell from October to April. Too young to appreciate them, my poet brain not yet obsessed with the moon and stars. My farmer father may have noticed, may have tilted his face upward, his eyes wide as the stars that glimmered bright on cold winter mornings, before returning to the endless tasks, feeding the cattle, mending fences, fixing machinery. I wish I'd talked to him about the stars, learned his favorite constellations, wondered at his ability to quickly find the North Star and orient himself. But I didn't, and he's gone. His body returned to the earth, which means, I guess, he's returned to the galaxy, because aren't we all made of stars? And if so, isn't he still shining down on me each night? I'm going to read a couple of poems from my new book. This one is titled, "What This Elegy Wants." It doesn't want flowers or flowery language. In fact, it wants to quiet the poet in me. It wants to remind me my father was of the earth and wants wheat instead of white lilies, wants soybeans and sunflowers and the seeds he spread each spring. After he quit farming, he planted a garden, and each summer we bonded over tomatoes and cucumbers, the mint I had to pull up at the root to stop it from taking over. And when he died in the fall, my garden kept producing, as if he was there, gentling the vegetables into giving more. Each time I buried my hands in the soil, I talked to my father, certain he could hear me, certain his hands were covering mine, guiding me as I weeded and thinned and harvested. What this elegy wants is a garden every summer, the sun kissing the seedlings that burst through the ground, my hands digging quietly. This elegy wants earth and sunshine and soft rain. This elegy wants my hands in the dirt, my father in the soil of his heart, growing long past the season of his life. And lastly, I'm going to read the poem where the collection gets its title. As I mentioned earlier, I grew up in the 80s, but I have an older sister who's 8 years older than I am, and so she would record movies from like Showtime onto VHS, and my younger sister and I would watch them, which meant we watched a lot of movies that were probably not appropriate for our age, but most of the inappropriate themes went over our head, but they remain movies that are still near and dear to me, and this poem is about one of those movies, and it's titled, "The Night My Father Died, We Made My Brother-in-Law Watch Dirty Dancing." Because the whole week was exhausting. None of us slept, our eyes swollen from crying. My throat was so sore, I worried it was strep. When the strep test came back negative, I worried it was COVID. The hospital bed still sat in the corner with medical supplies stacked beside it. The neighbors kept bringing over food, and so we grief ate. That morning, I woke at 3:45 a.m. to give my father his dose of morphine. I found my mother asleep in the recliner, and when I woke her, she said, I couldn't hear him breathing from the bedroom. I sent her to bed, tucked the syringe into my dad's cheek, and pushed the plunger slowly, the morphine absorbing because he could no longer swallow. I stayed up until 5 a.m., dozed until 6:30 when my mom woke and took over so I could go for a run, because it's hard to cry while running. And when my dad's brothers and sister arrived, I greeted them in the driveway, the day cruelly bright and beautiful. It took his brothers 3 tries to make it into the house, 3 tries to say goodbye. My aunt called my sister by the wrong name, but none of us corrected her. And then my dad's best friend showed up. It took him 30 minutes and 4 cigarettes to gain the courage to hold his hand. And when my dad took his last breath, we didn't realize for a moment he was gone. But no inhale followed, and I couldn't find a pulse. I kept my fingers on his wrist, hoping to feel the tiny blip, but it didn't come. And so that night, my sister and my mother and I watched a movie we'd seen a dozen times. We sang along to the soundtrack and laughed when Jim didn't know the plot. We needed nostalgia and distraction and a happy ending. We needed Baby up on that stage, her whole bright life ahead of her. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney. So I
We
think
we have a lot of questions here. Do you feel up to taking a few questions?
I will answer all of them.
Oh, good. The first one is, when did you first find your affinity for poetry?
Oh, goodness. I started writing as an early teen, which means I wrote a lot of very terrible, angsty, emotional, really cliched filled poetry. But that was really where I found it. And then I kept writing. In my 30s, I got serious about it and pursued my MFA, a Master's in Fine Arts and Poetry. And then my first book was published in my early 40s, and I've had 3 published since. So it goes way, way back to teenage years.
Do you still have all those poems?
Oh God, no. Thankfully, a lot of them have been burned or recycled, which is where they all belong.
Do you have a certain poetry format you use for your poems?
No, mostly I write free verse, which you can make it look however you want on the page. I do sometimes do form poetry. I like villanelles. I think that they are really good when you're struggling to write a poem, because they can give you some boundaries to stay within, and then it kind of forces you to write something. So I most often just do free verse, but I will write some form poetry sometimes.
What is it you hope to accomplish as the Poet Laureate, and how long will you be in this position?
It's a 2-year position, so it started in July of this year, 23. So it's through, I guess, June of 25. What I hope to accomplish, I have a couple of specific things that I hope to do. Like I want to do a nature walk with nature poetry, take people through like a lovely walk through the woods here in Arlington and read some poems and then provide some prompts. I also want to do a multilingual poetry reading, because we have a very diverse community here in Arlington, and I think that reading in your whatever language you prefer can be really freeing and really beautiful. And then I just want to generally participate and bring as much poetry as I can to Arlington at large.
Is this a full-time job, or is this something that you?
Oh goodness, no. I have a day job. If I could just do poetry and make a living, I definitely would. But I work for the government during the day.
Do you think that Chat GPT and AI will have an impact on poetry and poets?
That is a really good question. It's been, obviously, AI has been a lot in the news. I think it will have an impact, but not the impact that we're worried about. I don't think that Chat GPT is going to take over and write all of our poems, because I think there is something personal and specific that comes with writing poems, and I don't think that any sort of programming can do that. Now, if there's a robot uprising and I'm wrong, I will eat my words. But I think that for now, I think it will have less of an impact on poetry. I think it has a greater impact on other things that people write, like students writing research papers. I think that has a more initial impact from those things than poetry will.
And do you find that some poems are difficult to even understand, even though they are considered classics?
Yes. It's one of the reasons I encourage people to read living poets. I'm okay if I don't understand every poem. I think that's totally fine. but I don't want to read a whole book where I have no idea what the poet is talking about. For me, that's not enjoyable, and I don't connect with that. And so a lot of the classics are like that. They're using language that I'm not familiar with. They're using words that we don't really use anymore in the English language, or they're talking about things that no longer pertain. So, you know, I'm in my 40s. I want to read about the things that other women in their 40s are dealing with because that's what I identify with. And so I'm much more, I almost exclusively read living poets. The exception would be like those who have recently passed away. Those I will read, but like the dead people from 100 years ago does not really appeal to me. Honestly, it's just, there are some good ones in there, but it's more like poem specific as opposed to their whole collection, personally.
Is it possible to teach people how to write poetry? Might you consider teaching a class of older adults, young people? How would you do that?
Yes, 100%. I think everyone can write poetry. The reality of it is you can just write a sentence and then break it up into line breaks and ta-da, it's a poem. But what I do, I have taught to both older communities and younger communities. And what I do is I usually start with a really easy poem. And it's a poem by Laurent Beausoleil that she talks about the things she hates. And it's really easy to come up with things you hate. And then the last line in the poem is, and this makes loving you so much more. And so the whole poem is about all these things she hates, but then it's also about this person she really, really loves. And I think I've done it before with like 4th and 5th graders, and it was hilarious to hear this because they had all the things they hated. Somebody hated broccoli. Another person hated water, which must be very complicated for bath time for that child. But I think, you know, you can always think of things you hate, and the more you list them, that becomes then that turn at the end of the poem where you love loving someone. That's that much more impactful after listing all these things you hate. And it's an easy poem that everyone, young and old, can write, and it can be meaningful. And that's one of those poems where you can get really weird too, which I think is super fun and makes poetry less intimidating. You're allowed to be weird, and that's great because we're all weird. It's just in different ways, and some of us are more comfortable claiming it, like myself. And so, yeah, I love teaching poetry, and I am definitely open to doing workshops for young and old. Maybe I'll talk to Dan and we'll see what we can come up with for the future.
Is the job description of a poet laureate the same in all places? If not, how does it differ?
I don't know the specifics on that. I would say that generally it's likely all the same. For Arlington itself, I have a couple of key things I have to do. Dan talked about the programs the poet is in. I'll participate in that as the poet laureate. I can tell you I've participated just as a community poet several years in a row, and it is one of my favorite things. In April, come to the public libraries. It's usually every weekend at one of the locations. It is so much fun to write a poem on demand for someone. Young and old, everyone seems to really delight in it. And then like the moving words, where they put a poem on the buses, I will judge that competition. That is something I also really love because there is nothing like being on a bus and seeing a poem on it. And often, because I know a lot of local poets, I will recognize that person, and then I can take a picture of it and send it to them, which is delightful. So I think most poet laureate positions have the same basic structure, and then the specifics probably vary based on location.
Location of it. Dan, do you want to tell us a little? I'm sorry.
I had a question, kind of the reverse of teaching people to write poetry. Do you have advice, or have you ever, what would you do to teach people to better read poetry, better appreciate it, especially things like free verse that can sometimes be kind of challenging to get into?
Definitely. I think the best way is to just keep reading. And if reading a whole book of poetry is overwhelming because you're afraid you won't understand it, that's totally fine. There are a lot of websites like Poetry Daily. If you subscribe to them, they will send one poem a day to your email, which can be a great way to not only read new poets, but not be overwhelmed by it, because it's just one poem, and they often include a little paragraph at the end that the poet has written that sometimes explains or gets into some of the details about the poem. And that can be a really great way to sort of, dip your toes into the world of poetry and get some experience about what poems are about and who's out there writing. It's a good way.
Okay.
We have
Did you
another-
apply to be poet laureate, or were you chosen without prior involvement?
I applied. The announcement was made in like late spring of 23, and then it was you submitted an application, provided I think a sample of poems. I uploaded a video of myself reading a poem, and then Dan and his coworkers got together and reviewed, and then it went from there. And then I got the news in May, so I was very excited, and I just sit on it for like almost 2 months and not share it, which was very hard to do, but worth it because it was really exciting when it was announced.
What do you want this audience to know about why poems are important in our lives, and how can more people learn to like poetry?
I think poems are important because, particularly if you're reading modern living poets, they often talk about things that you're dealing with day to day. They're talking about what it's like to live in America today, which, is different than what it looked like 10, 20, 30 years ago. The landscape has changed. They're writing about the body and the aging body, which I think is, something that we all have to deal with, regardless of where we're at currently. It happens. Nobody gets to escape it. They write about, I think that it's important because poets are able to succinctly write about the things that everyone deals with at some point in their life: love, life, death, trauma, hope, and I think that people find connection. I certainly find connection when I read poems that are dealing with the things that I'm currently dealing with or have dealt with. And then how can more people learn to like poetry? I think you just start by reading it, and don't worry about if you don't understand every poem or every aspect of every poem. I don't, and I've been reading poetry my whole life. There are some poems that I'm just never going to understand or never going to really like as a result. And then there are other poems that just blow me away because it's like they reached into my heart and my brain and they pulled out exactly what I was feeling. And I think if you start reading poems and start trying to make it, read a poem a day. If that's, take 10 minutes and think about it. And I think that will bring people to poetry and help them learn to love it, because soon they'll start realizing they understand what this poem is talking about and they see themselves in it. And that's a really lovely feeling, I think.
Now, I read a book a while ago called Rhymes Rooms. It's all about poetry, and he breaks it down into meter and rhythm and slant rhymes and all the different technical aspects of poems. And it really kind of taught me how much more there is going on in a lot of poetry than just, do the words rhyme at the end. And I guess my question is, do you, when you're writing a poem, do you pull those techniques in and go, okay, I want to put, this in this poem, or I want these lines that are 4 lines apart to echo each other in a certain way?
I think the answer is it depends. I rarely write poems that rhyme. I don't care for them usually. And I pay no attention to meter or iambic pentameter or slant rhymes or any of those like official terms for poetry. I think it's great for people who do like that and are able to write like that, but I'm not. When I write a poem, it is literally vomit on the page. I'm often writing so fast because I need to get the words out that my handwriting is near illegible by the end. But then after, when I'm workshopping it and editing it and making it look a little prettier, I will pay attention to some of those things where I realize upon reading it out loud, one word works better than another because the flow of that line or the flow of the poem. But when I'm initially writing, none of that comes into play for me. All of that is pushed aside and I'm just getting words on the page as fast as I can.
Would it be easier to write a poem about a topic rather than a short story? And how do you determine how long your poems are going to be?
So poetry versus short story. Well, for me, the difference is in poetry, there are no rules. I can have half sentences. I can make up words. Generally, when you're writing a story, you have to have plot. If there's dialogue in there, the verb tenses have to match. There are certain rules that generally you follow when writing prose, which is what a short story is. I can ignore all of that when I write poetry. And so for me, poetry is so freeing that I don't think I would be able to convey it in a short story as effectively. With poetry, you're choosing every single word often to make sure it has an impact. And in short stories, you have the ability to stretch things out. And I don't know how to do that. So I don't think I would ever write it. I think for me, it is easier to write a poem, and determining how long the poems will be, it really just depends. I write until it feels finished. And sometimes I will come back to a poem because I realize it's not yet finished and I need to work on it and write some more. And then other times I will come back to a poem and chop it in half because I realize it's much more effective without that second batch of lines. So it's really just dependent on the poem itself.
Have any of your poems been translated into other languages, and how does that work?
I have had a poem translated into Portuguese, so it hasn't happened very often for me. The way it works is usually you get contacted by a person or, let's say, a literary press or a journal that wants to translate your work, and they usually ask permission, and you say yes or no. And then it's just kind of a relationship of trust, because I don't speak any other language fluently, and so I have to just trust that they are making the choices to translate the poem and hold its original meaning in another language. So
if somebody's going to be reading poetry, do you recommend that they read it out loud as opposed to somebody reading it?
I think that reading it out loud can bring a new understanding to it. I generally, when I'm reading a book of poetry, only read it, to myself in my head. But reading a poem out loud can be really, really powerful. Every workshop I've ever taken, you usually read the poems out loud with the group, because it's also different to hear it in someone else's voice. You pick up on things that you may not have picked up when you read it on the page. So I think it can be really, really helpful in understanding a poem, and also just a way to get into the poem in a different way.
Anybody else have any additional questions, comments?
I wanted Dan to talk a little bit more about his job and what he does for the library.
Sure. So I'm a part of Arlington Cultural Affairs, which is strangely nested under Arlington Economic Development. So, it's a mix. My work is focused purely on the literary programming, and my office is focused on arts programming, but we're mixed in with sort of like tourism and business development and other kind of efforts that are going on through Arlington County government. So a lot of times we have special programs come up through community events that are already happening. So for example, the Day of the Dead celebration that happens at the Modern Art Museum in Arlington. They've invited us to have poets, bilingual poets who are, reading in Spanish and English, present there. So we're kind of a community partner. We're always open to events. We also have another event coming up at the Walter Reed Community Center in October for National Black Poetry Day. So if you know of any sort of like local community events or organizations like yours, and they want to involve the arts, we're open to work with community groups and set things up. Then we also have our own sort of standard programming. Courtney mentioned the Moving Words program. That program will be opening up for submissions for adults in October. So if you write a short poem, less than 10 lines, it could end up on a bus. Courtney will be our judge. So now you have a sense of what she likes and how she writes. So if you're a poet yourself, keep an eye out for that on our social media pages. And we'll be spreading the word about that pretty widely. But that's our next upcoming event for this fall.
So Dan, I just wanted to ask, so do you, I wasn't quite sure I was hearing correctly. So you do activities, whether it's poets or arts kinds of activities specifically for older adults in the Arlington area? Is that what you said, or did I not hear that correctly?
So we serve all different communities. We don't have anything poetry related that's specifically for older adults, but we're certainly open to programming ideas. So that's definitely something we can look at in the future. Courtney and I, as we've talked about, what she's going to do during her term, we've talked about workshops as an option and other kind of like very specific community serving type programs, but nothing is settled yet. We're just getting started. I do think that there's a lot of interest in that poetry walk, nature hike kind of idea. So that's something we'll probably be developing across the next couple months and maybe putting it on in the spring when the weather's not quite as hot, but not the cold weather we're hoping for this winter. So.
Right, because one thing I was just going to add is that in the Washington area, there is an organization called Arts for the Aging. And I know the woman who runs it. And in fact, I've done a couple of shows in which I interviewed her, and they invite artists, and Courtney might be a good one, or you, Dan, in which they go to various places and work with the older adults who live there, and conduct some kind of a class. It could be dance class or singing or whatever, but poetry writing might also. But the woman who is the executive director is named Janine Tersini, T as in Tom, U-R-S as in Sam, I-N as in Nancy, Janine Tersini. But you may want to get in touch, or you can send me a note too, and I'd be happy to provide more information. But it's Arts for the Aging.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Carolyn, you're on mute.
Yeah, I got it. We have the most important question of the day. Did you name your puppy after a poet?
I did not. I have two dogs. One of them is sleeping on the couch behind me. That's Cricket. Piper is probably in her bed. But while not named after poets, I do keep a running list of potential dog names. I'm a really big dog lover, and they almost all come from books I've read. Dan mentioned I'm a voracious reader. I read over 300 books a year.
Oh my
Most
goodness.
of them are from the public library. I read a lot. My goal is to one day hit 365 so I can get a book a day.
Oh
I'm
my
not
goodness.
quite there yet. So most of them come from characters in books, but not specifically poets.
Okay. And both for you, Courtney and Dan, Steve Portal just put in the chat the website for artsfortheaging.org, so you can check that out.
Thank you.
So any other questions? We're getting close to 11 o'clock, and that's usually when we finish, 10:56 here.
I had one last question.
Okay.
You gave us the names of the poets you recommended earlier, and I noticed that 5 out of the 6 are women. Is that personal preference? Are there other male poets you would recommend? Or does that reflect the state of poetry in the country right now, that most of the poets are female?
Well, most writers are actually women. Women tend to publish more books than men, but men tend to be higher paid and get larger advances. So personally, I choose to read more women. I think that they're an important voice that has been underrepresented forever. But also just as a woman myself, that's voices I identify with more. There are a lot of male poets that I also love, but I think you know, trying to get some equality and balance things out here a little bit, I always am going to recommend the women poets before I recommend the men. Although I will give a small plug for Dan. He didn't talk about it, but he is an amazing poet. I love his work. I have all his books, and I thought it would be awkward if I listed him in the chat as well. But you should buy his books; they are delightful.
Thank you.
Good plug. Thank you for sharing that. So unless I hear comments or questions from anyone else, just a quick plug for next week's Coffee and Conversation. The topic will be the Capital Caring Hospice. Our guest will be Steve Cohen, who is with Capital Caring Hospice, and he'll talk about hospice care and provide an update on the renovation of the Helquist Center, and also share the difference between hospice care and palliative care and the related topics. So be sure and tune in next week for Coffee and Conversation. So please stay cool, everybody. We got a couple more days of hot weather, and hopefully we'll start seeing fall weather here in Arlington. So, and thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Dan. It was a very excellent presentation today. And one quick question I did have to ask you, Courtney, where did you grow up in the Midwest?
I grew up on a farm in North Dakota.
North Dakota, okay.
Very different from here. I've been on the East Coast. I came out here for college and stayed. So it's dramatically different from Arlington in many, many good ways.
Well, I grew up in Wisconsin, not on a farm, but I'm very familiar with the Midwest. And interestingly, my sister-in-law grew up in Fargo, North Dakota.
Goodness.
So
that's where my family retired to. That's where my parents live.
okay. Well, I think there's a lot of transplanted Midwesterners here on the East Coast. So we could have a conversation about that sometime. So
no doubt.
Anyway, it's 11 o'clock or 10:59. So everybody have a good week. Stay safe and stay healthy. Wear your masks. COVID might be coming back, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.